Well, welcome to Deeply Rooted Botanical Medicine with Stephanie Georgieff, and this is our weekly feature, This Week in Botanical Medicine. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this podcast. It features on Substack as well as wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're not a Substack subscriber, say that 3 times with marbles in your mouth, please do so. For now, it's still free. You get all the goodies and it's still free. So that would be wonderful if you decide to subscribe to the Substack. And before we get started, I'm your host, producer, content creator, and I do have an amazing course offerings on Teachable. It's called the Living Pharmacy School. So I highly urge you to check out the links in the program notes in order to see about that. Now, on all of the courses, the botanical medicine courses, there are always a couple of these lecture videos and handouts that are free. So they're for public viewing. So if you want to get a taste of what the course has to offer, this is a wonderful way to do that. Now, as many of you know, I subscribe to all sorts of updates, listservs, research updates, things like that regarding medicine, health, alternative medicine, research. From all perspectives, I think that everybody has something interesting to offer, so I look at what everybody is saying. And this is how I find the information for everything that I do regarding health information, course creation, all sorts of things like that. And one of the most interesting ones that I subscribe to is a service from PubMed, which is called Medscape. And this gives updates and clinical information. You can sign up for all different kinds, but the one I sign up for, in addition to others, is the Medscape on obesity. And a full disclosure, I have struggled with my weight throughout my many decades on this planet. And I have had success with things like eating, ready for this, healthy, well-balanced meals, and low-impact exercises such as yoga, walking, and hiking. And I've done various types of different botanicals and supplements. And, they work, but they all work if you're doing things like eating a healthy, well-balanced diet on what I call foods that remember where they came from, which means, instead of electric blue colored raspberry, popsicles, I will eat a raspberry. I've yet to see a blue raspberry in nature. But I just find when I eat whole foods, I don't buy a lot of processed foods, which means I don't buy canned things like soups and sauces. And when I can, I actually make my own condiments. So I make my own salad dressings. And none of this takes a ton of time. Everybody thinks that you have to have tons of time. And really, organization is basically the key, and it's much less expensive to eat this way, and you're not generating so much trash, and you're also being able to monitor how many chemicals and things like salt, sugar, and fat get into your body. If you're eating processed foods, even the ones that tout that they're diet, or low calorie, etc., you're getting all sorts of things that, in my opinion, the human body doesn't know what to do with. And that's why we're all overweight. So when I follow those programs, even as I've gotten older, I always lose weight. And I'm not a skinny, athletic person. I have never been that way. I was a chubby little kid. Everybody made fun of me. But then I started taking my nutrition into my own hands and eating huge potfuls of things like bean sprouts and zucchini and cabbage instead of chips and other things. And I started losing weight as a teenager. And then I go through various phases in my adult life. But you need to understand, and especially in my physiology, I'm a postmenopausal woman, hence the white hair, natural white hair. There are many physiological changes that we go through as we age, and I'm not a person that is upset about getting older. I've enjoyed most phases of my life, and I'm enjoying this one, and I don't mind looking my age. And I can tell you, it's a lot less expensive and time consuming to look your age, as long as you're healthy. But anyways, I'm a postmenopausal woman. There's many changes. And one of the big changes that we all go through as we get older is we basically lose about 10% of muscle mass in every decade. And we humans need muscle to burn fat. And as our muscle mass decreases, the fat burning capacity of muscles also decreases because there's less of it. And this is really why, as we age, we tend to pack on the pounds. And this is also why we cannot eat like we used to when we were young. And, I remember as a young woman, in my early 20s and my teens, if I wanted to drop 10 pounds, I just did a bunch of aerobics and drank lemon water for a day. And then I was, could fit into whatever outfit I needed to fit into. And I've never been anorexic. I love to eat too much, and I really hate vomiting. So none of those things have ever been an issue in my personal life. But I can't lose weight as quickly as I used to when I was younger, mainly because my muscle mass is going down. And so we just need to make peace somewhat that our body composition changes as we get older. And this also affects our obesity. Now, these are just disclaimers because I do have some news about botanical medicine this week. But another caveat is, and it's been fascinating to me since I was a young woman, is the entire weight loss industry. And we're talking a multi-billion-dollar industry. And it's specifically in developed countries, what we would call developed countries that are industrially based. And this has just been an issue in civilized societies for a very long time. Now, when I grew up in the 1970s, this was when Weight Watchers was all the rage, and it was very successful when followed, and it was basically a support system for eating healthy. That's basically what it was. And way back then, there weren't all the artificial sweeteners and diet foods and this and that and the other thing. So, it was all about eating healthy foods and limiting portions. And back then, and my mother did this, we as a family actually followed strict all-bite, well-balanced diet, and this included, and this was all mandatory, you had to follow a very strict diet if you belonged to Weight Watchers. You had to eat liver once a week, which my mother followed studiously. And this was not a problem for her because she liked liver, but the rest of us did not. So this meant me and my siblings figured out all sorts of ingenious ways to pretend we were eating the liver, only to discard it discreetly through various methods. I think you can hear I have a friend here in my recording studio. But anyways, in any case, I've been fascinated with the focus on Medscape obesity updates, and we're talking once a week, and almost all of these updates are on various studies and discoveries regarding GLP-1 drugs. Now, I'm sure you're hearing a lot about this, but GLP-1 receptor agonists, that's what they're called officially, are synthetic or peptide-based medications, and they have various very well-known and advertised brand names that I will not name. Not that I'm against that, it's just you get into all sorts of trouble when you name things. But anyways, these medications were initially developed for type 2 diabetes, but they're now widely prescribed for weight management. And basically what they do is they mimic natural hormones. They artificially activate the body's GLP-1 receptors, which have a lot to do with hunger. And what these drugs do is they overpower normal physiological signaling. These drugs dramatically delay gastric emptying, which means it keeps food in the stomach longer, which prolongs fullness. And these drugs cross the blood-brain barrier, which is what keeps your brain healthy, basically. Stuff doesn't get up into your brain. Now, certain things do get up there, obviously, neuropeptides and certain drugs and hormones and things like that. But the blood-brain barrier usually keeps things out of the brain that are harmful to the brain. And what these drugs do is they cross the blood-brain barrier and directly suppress appetite centers in the hypothalamus, which reduce food cravings. And these drugs also stimulate insulin secretion. They suppress glucagon release when blood sugar is high. Now, again, because I'm an alternative medicine practitioner, I'm very much into health sovereignty. If you choose, anybody chooses, I think we should all have the freedom to choose what we want to do with our bodies. And even though I may disagree with something, I respect the freedom because I want people to have the freedom to take botanical medicines, supplements, do acupuncture, practice yoga, all sorts of things, do chiropractic medicine. I want the freedom for those therapeutic modalities. So I respect the freedom to do orthodox medicine. And I applaud anybody that exercises their freedom. I, however, don't always agree with certain things. And I personally feel that these GLP-1 agonist drugs are not going to have a good long-term outcome. We're basically doing an amazing scientific experiment with millions and millions and millions of people. And I've been participating in some research studies through a local university, and you show up and you do whatever it is they want you to do. And you obviously, it's informed consent, and I'm not doing anything violent or taking any substance. But anyways, I get paid when I become a research subject. And what we're doing with these GLP-1 agonist drugs is we are paying these pharmaceutical industries billions and billions of dollars. And with some recent policy updates in the United States, it sounds like there's going to be some government subsidies of these certain drugs. And so we're basically doing an amazing experiment. And I can tell you, when I read these Medscape obesity bullet points, it's really interesting what's going on in terms of what these drugs are doing now that they're out in the public and are being taken. We're going to see what's going to happen with these over a long period of time. Now, my issue, and again, this is my personal, I respect people's choices. I want to make that very clear. I respect people's choices. But my issue with all of the surgical and drug approaches to weight loss and, these bariatric surgeries, in my opinion, are rather violent. It's wow. Chopping out parts of your organs. It's amazing. And then they also do things where they put sleeves around the stomach so it can't expand. And I mean, these are really drastic procedures. And then these drugs that do really interesting things like cross the blood-brain barrier and affect how the pancreas works and all sorts of things. What these approaches to weight loss do is they basically curb the amount of food a person takes in, which for the majority of the population usually results in weight loss. There's always, food in, food out, calories burned doesn't really count. I'm sorry. The physiology just doesn't work that way. But anyways, sometimes you can have very serious hormonal, endocrine disorders, and it really doesn't matter how much you eat. Your body maintains a certain amount of weight regardless of exercise and food intake. And that usually is very successfully treated with some sort of hormonal therapy. But you need a big workup. And you need to be under the care of an endocrinologist and a general physician and all sorts of things in order to make sure that, your issue is being treated. And I just look at things as a naturopath, and I look at things as a traditional Chinese medicine practitioner. And we are always interested in what causes something. Because if you understand the cause, then you can treat it effectively. And so these, in my opinion, if all of these drastic surgeries with organ removals and drugs that are involved in altering, how your receptors in your brain and your hypothalamus and all this other stuff is working, and the big issue is it reduces the amount of food you eat, that's really interesting to me. And so my question is, why not just eat less? And I can say that because I've struggled with weight loss. I struggle with it. And, but I've been successful with it. And I'm always successful when I limit the amount of food that I'm taking in, and I'm doing some sort of moderate exercise, and I eat whole natural food, which means, maybe not even eating things with flour, just eat the whole grain, not flour, but eat like bulgur wheat, stuff like that. So this really gets to the heart of the modern weight loss paradox. And, when you get down to the mechanism of action, whether it's a bariatric sleeve, a daily pharmaceutical, or other thing, the ultimate bottleneck is always caloric reduction. And this is natural caloric reduction, because these fake fat and fake sweeteners, they also have very undesirable side effects and long-term impacts on human health. Now, the reason why you need to understand, just eating less, and I'm not a huge fan of prolonged fasting, and I'm not even clear about intermittent fasting, because it's like, well, okay, so you only eat for 8 hours a day, but you basically eat whatever you want. Well, you can be eating, if you're like me, I can fit in a whole lot of calories into 8,000, into 8 hours. But anyways, what you need to keep in mind is evolutionary biology and metabolic adaptation. And there's a primal starvation response. And this is why things like bariatric surgery or taking a GLP-1 agonist for a certain amount of time, as soon as you stop the drug, you start to gain weight and at a rapid rate. And also what happens with people with these bariatric surgeries is, yeah, they're maybe eating like 200 or 300 calories a day, but then when they start eating 500 calories a day, they start gaining weight. Okay? So the long-term weight loss with these drastic methods is not guaranteed. So when caloric intake drops, the human brain triggers a primal survival alarm. It dramatically upregulates hunger hormones like ghrelin, and it suppresses satiety signals to force you to seek food. And this isn't a lack of willpower, it's biological drive that makes constant hunger. It's very difficult to manage. And it also, when you stop eating, or eat a lot less, you have a metabolic slowdown. And that's why healthy weight loss is gradual. And yeah, maybe in the beginning you're eating very few calories, but you slowly increase the amount of calories after significant weight loss. If you restrict your calories over time, the body aggressively lowers its basal metabolic rate to conserve energy, and you need fewer and fewer calories just to maintain base-like function, which is why chronic dieters hit frustrating plateaus and experience rapid weight gain the moment they return to normal eating. And modern food engineering actively hijacks the brain's reward pathways, which is basically dopamine signaling. And it's interesting because when I live in Eastern Europe, I basically eat just whole seasonal food because that's what's available. You can buy stuff, but I don't like it anyway. And it's rather expensive. But sometimes when I'm traveling or I'm visiting friends and I start eating their processed food because it's fun, because these foods are fun and they taste really good, then I find, God, I'm more hungry and I want more and more and more and more. Well, they do that on purpose. That's what they do in these food engineering labs. So just know that when you start eating, if you want to go on any type of avoidance, avoid anything processed, anything. And that means eating whole, fresh fruits and vegetables, whole grains that you cook, dried beans that you cook in a slow cooker, and any type of fresh meat, whatever kind of meat you want, but don't do all these preparated foods, all these things, because they put stuff in them to mainly increase shelf life, but that also increases your hunger. And so what you find when you're eating whole foods that you make yourself, you eat less actually. And then when you eat less and you feel full longer, you tend to lose weight. Now, the long-term gamble of pharmaceutical and surgical approaches, they alter all sorts of things. They lead to lifelong issues with malabsorption, severe nutritional deficiencies, and then the GLP-1s. These are prescribed as lifelong medications, okay? And wow. And, isn't that interesting? So when patients stop taking them, the metabolic breaks vanish. The clinical trials show that the vast majority of lost weight along with systemic inflammation and elevated cardiovascular markers, which means your blood work will make your physician scream at you, returns rapidly. And what these also do is there's a rapid loss of lean muscle mass, which you need to burn weight or burn fat. And they're finding that there's bone density issues. People are becoming osteoporotic and osteopenic on these drugs. But if you want to do this is great. Now, which brings us to the subject of this edition's of This Week in Botanical Medicine. So you get to hear me on my little herb box. But what I was reading this week in my many listservs, and I felt like I needed to give that preamble, is there was a fascinating study involving the plant hops. That's HOPS, Humulus lupulus, and it's a famous herb that's involved in beer fermentation, as well as used as a nervine relaxant and digestive. And the substance that is found in hops is called, and it's not necessarily a synthetic compound, but it is a synthesized compound. Much to my chagrin, just taking hops isn't going to do as much magic as this very interesting constituent of hops. And this constituent is called americate. And this is synthesized from a bitter found in hops. And hops is a nervine, but it's also a bitter. And bitters do all kinds of interesting things to the brain. And if you want to learn more about that, you can sign up for my course, The Living Pharmacy from Seed to Body to Soul. And I go through bitters extensively because that's one of the biggest benefits of fresh vegetables, especially bitter greens and bitter herbs. Anyways, these bitters do really interesting things to the brain. They trigger all sorts of digestive processes, particularly making something called bile. And I was really intrigued by this study, mainly because this substance is really a very different paradigm on weight loss. And it's rather than bypassing human physiology with pharmaceuticals or permanently altering anatomy, plant-based bitter compounds work with the body's innate feedback loops, and they activate endogenous bitter taste receptors, which are called TAS2Rs, in the gut to remind the body of its own natural satiety intelligence. And this bridges the gap between the feeling of being full without destroying your entire endocrine system long term or chopping out parts of your body. Now, when I was young and, quite a bit thinner in naturopathic school, we were taught that eating small, high-fiber meals throughout the day was the way to keep blood sugar even. And this would mitigate the starvation and store calories as fat mechanism. And this is why I've been very hesitant about intermittent fasting. I don't buy it. And it's basically because I don't see how throwing the body into ketosis every day is a great idea, So that's me. But the principle of eating small, high-fiber, nutrient-dense meals, and what this does is it keeps the blood sugar stable. And if the blood sugar is stable, you don't have these, surges which actually trigger the hunger response and also trigger the body to store things as fat, okay? And this is a cornerstone of traditional naturopathic therapy. And this eating small, high fiber, nutrient dense meals throughout the day completely bypasses this biological panic button by keeping blood sugar curves smooth, which prevents massive insulin spikes and subsequent crashes that scream starvation to your brain. So this is my idea. And as I said, in terms of medicine, we need to understand why something is happening. We need to understand the mechanism of why things that are happening, what's causing it. And as soon as we understand that, then it's very easy to mitigate or inspire healing. But to say, oh, well, that's why, so let's just bypass it and chop out organs and mimic hormones and alter brain function. In my opinion, again, this is my opinion, this is how addicts are created, and you get lifelong patients and lifelong consumers. That's what you get. So this is a real physiological perspective. We know exactly how cellular mechanisms that validate this, this whole thing of keeping blood sugar. And I don't know if you remember, there was a whole thing about eating, low glycemic foods, which are all high fiber foods. If you eat a banana, that's a high glycemic. It sparks your blood sugar. But if you eat an apple or kale or, something like that, it keeps your blood sugar even. And this is really important. Now, why did modern medicine overlook this simple solution? And my brother used to do this. He would just pack himself, little bags of veggies. And he's a dentist, and he's a very busy man, and he's on his feet all day and this and that. And we have all inherited these wonderful fat-loving genes. And he would just measure out his food, his little snack bags, which are basically veggies and things like nuts and stuff like that. And he would eat that throughout the day. And that's how he maintained his weight in a healthy way. And the challenge is that modern pharmaceutical and diet industries prefer interventions that can be packaged, patented, and marketed as a silver bullet. And this is the multi-billion-dollar push for injectable peptides or restrictive crash diets. And teaching people how to eat high-fiber foods to stabilize their blood sugar requires behavior change, patience, and an understanding of biochemistry that isn't very lucrative in the long haul. So what's interesting to me is the numbers behind GLP drugs. They are staggering. In the United States, the adoption of these drugs has scaled at an unprecedented velocity. They're actually running out of these drugs, and people who have diabetes don't have access to them because everybody's trying to lose weight. And recent polling data, and this is from organizations such as Gallup and KFF, shows that approximately 11 to 12% of U.S. adults are currently using a GLP-1 medication. Okay, that's a lot of people. There's like 380 million people, so that's a lot of people. And you multiply that by a monthly pharmaceutical bill, you can see why the stock is going up. And prescription for obesity medications has skyrocketed nearly 590% between 2019 and 2024. And this has continued to climb as public awareness and oral formulations. So they're starting to make oral GLP-1 agonists. And these are usually amongst adults aged 50 to 64, with women utilizing them at roughly 1.5 times the rate of men. And gee, look at that age group. That's when women go through menopause and you start losing muscle mass and little things like that. And analysts at JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley, and those are the people we want dictating health policy, right? Estimate that the US user base, which is about 10 million people, could expand to 25 or 30 million by the end of this decade as insurance coverage and public health programs such as Medicare, Medicaid pilot structures adapt. Now, the US remains the dominant consumer market, but Europe is catching up. Internationally, market penetration remains much lower, but analysts estimate that only 2% of eligible obese or overweight population and 7% of diabetic patients outside the US are currently using GLP-1 therapy. But the European GLP-1 market is massive and expanding rapidly. And I think in one of my recent programs, I was talking how French plastic surgeons were remarking that they needed to up their marketing strategies and clinical skills to deal with these drooping faces from rapid weight loss due to these GLP-1 and drugs used in Europe. And the sale was 22 billion by the early 2030s. That's the market projection. And it's Germany, Denmark, and the United Kingdom that apparently are going to be using this. There's all sorts of, outside of Western nations, patent expiration for key molecules in regions such as China, India, and parts of Latin America are expected to shift the landscape. And these places are starting to eat like Americans. And I can tell you in places like Albania and India, particularly, and in Latin America, all over South America. And what they are seeing, public health experts are seeing, is a dramatic rise in childhood obesity as well as onset of type 2 diabetes in all age demographics. And it's really worrying health experts in these countries. And the issue is, in my opinion, again, this is my opinion, is when these traditional cultures which eat wonderful cuisines, which are full of healthy, whole foods, lots of wonderful herbs and, spices, they're adapting to American industrial foods. And as soon as they do that, everybody gets fat. So this is not really great. So the study, which required that huge, long preamble, so you can see where my bias is. I think we should all be open. As I try to be a podcast journalist for natural medicine, I think I need to expose my biases. So the study investigates amerisate, and this is a proprietary plant extract derived from New Zealand bitter hops, and which is the Humulus lupulus. And what this does is, rather than acting as a synthetic GLP-1 receptor agonist drug, amerisate acts as an endogenous GLP stimulant. And again, I'm going back to my naturopathic training as well as my training as a traditional Chinese medicine and acupuncture. How we see anything that happens to the body and how we want to affect is we want to stimulate the natural body to do what it should be doing anyway. We don't want to overtake that. We don't want to force the body to do anything. We want to enhance the body's natural functioning. which is obviously not working. And so you look at the reason why the body is not working how it should, and then you try to stimulate the natural production of whatever it is you need to do. So this is what this americate is. And how does this interact with GLP-1, which is a natural thing in your body? Americate consists of concentrated bitter acid from hops designed with a delayed release capsule to open in the small intestine, which is also called the duodenum. And when these bitter compounds bind to bitter taste receptors located in the gut, they trigger a rapid cellular signaling cascade. And this prompts the body to naturally release a triad of satiety hormones. And this is GLP-1, the glucagon-like peptide 1, something called CCK, and PYY. And what this does is it signals this is this bitter compound, it signals it to activate it significantly above baseline levels. And this mimics the body's natural bitter brake mechanism, which signals fullness and slow digestion. The foundational research and clinical trial development on americate was spearheaded by the New Zealand Institute for Plant and Food Research. And this is a New Zealand government-backed research initiative. Clinical trials evaluating its impact on human appetite, hormones, and weight loss were published in peer-reviewed journals such as the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, as well as that very well-read Obesity Pillars journal. And what is so fascinating, this was a 24-week randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, evaluated adults taking this extract. And you can get this in the United States. It's called CaloCurb. And they found significant outcomes. There was weight and fat loss. Participants taking the hops extract lost an average of 8.3 to 8.4 pounds over 24 weeks. And this compared virtually to no change in the placebo group. But what's also interesting is it drove substantial reductions in visceral and total body fat. The other nice thing that this did was it preserved muscle mass. And remember, muscle is needed to burn fat. And when you're taking these drugs, not the synthesized plant material, but the drugs, there's significant muscle mass loss. Significant, okay? And this was a notable finding of the trial, that was that participants maintained or slightly preserved their lean muscle mass while losing fat mass. And this is very different from pharmaceutical options, which often, just because you're losing weight doesn't mean you're losing fat. And that's the problem with starving, okay? You might lose weight, but you're not losing fat. You want to lose fat. And it also found that if you take this an hour before meal, what this does is it signals those satiety hormones naturally, and it leads to a reduction in caloric intake, okay? And the people in the study noted drops in their subjective hunger and food cravings. And americate, which is also known as americate BHE, which I think is funny, it stands for bitter hop extract. It's a patented, highly concentrated botanical extract derived by Humulus lupulus, which is a global hops plant. And it's very interesting how this whole thing works. There really I did research because I'm always looking for ways to do certain things to my own body. And you can get some similar response if you take just plain old hops in a capsule. But what they're finding is that it's really good to take bitters in general. So that's what you can do. I've also found that working on things like the adrenals, because when your adrenals are really being overstimulated, you release a lot of cortisol and you tend to store things as fat. That's why you shouldn't eat while you're watching television, because television is upsetting and it spikes cortisol, which does all kinds of interesting things to your body. But things like digestive bitters, turmeric, all sorts of things like that definitely can help. But you can get this Calocurb, which is not cheap. Let's put it this way. It's not as expensive as the GLP-1 drugs, but it's not cheap. But it's I think it's really interesting. So I highly recommend reading up on this study, but know that nature does have something to offer. And if you're wanting long-term weight loss without destroying your physiology and anatomy in the process, this may be an answer. It may be an answer. So this is Stephanie Georgia saying thank you so much for spending your valuable time with me. I know this is a little longer than I tend to have on This Week in Botanical Medicine, but this I think is a really interesting study, and it brings up some really profound issues and is worth more than a simple overview. And for me, it always gets back to nature has an answer, and we need to seek natural therapies first before we go to an extensive intervention through other means. That's where I'm coming from. So make sure you check the links in the program notes, and until our next episode, make sure you subscribe to Substack. Make sure you read my weekly Friday column, Confessions of a White-Haired Herbalist. And until our next meeting, be well.